Hi everyone, my name's Michael, and as a child, I was a movie gameaholic. Like so many kids in Gen X, I got to enjoy massive video game arcades, and I got to see the meteoric rise of the home video game console. And somewhere along the way, I got obsessed with movie tie-in video games. It probably started with Atari's Star Wars and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in arcades. I loved those games, played them all the time when I could find them at the mall arcade or Showbiz, and I would just throw quarters or tokens into them whenever I could. And then when the home video game consoles arrived, or at least I became aware of them, the first video game that I had was on the system called the Vectrex. I still have my childhood Vectrex, it still works, and I had to have Star Trek the Motion Picture for Vectrex. Now, in that instance, it was one of the best games on the Vectrex, but what I didn't realize is that wasn't going to be the case for the legacy of most video game movie tie-ins. I wouldn't really learn this through childhood, as you can see here next to me. I would only realize this in retrospect. I kept making the same mistake over and over again as a kid. I lived in hope, what can I say? Next to me on this table, with the exception of one game, or should I say two, technically two, but with the exception of two games next to me, all of these games are my childhood original Nintendo and Super Nintendo cartridges. And yes, I was one of those kids that even though I was still in grade school, I kept the boxes and I kept the instruction manuals and I kept everything with it. Probably because video games were quite expensive, and I figured, well, you're paying for the box as much as you're paying for the cartridge. I mean, if it's that expensive, you might as well keep every piece of it you can. So that's probably why these cartridges are in such complete condition from going all the way back to when I was a kid. I'm glad I was that weird kid, because it's nice to have them in this condition now. So I get into adulthood, YouTube shows up on the internet, and I start seeing channels like Angry Video Game Nerd, and they start pumping out videos about the most hated, the worst games on all these consoles, and I'm starting to win bad game bingo from when I was a kid. It seemed like back then, every game these channels would bring up initially was one that I had as a kid that I asked for unironically. And they were talking about how terrible these games were, and in certain instances, I agreed with them. In other instances, when you're a kid, you're so adaptable and you're so determined. You just won't give up if you're that kind of kid. And you don't really have a perspective on much of anything else because you don't have unlimited funds. You only get a game at your birthday and at Christmas. And so that's what you've got unless your parents spring for a rental every now and then. So you make do with what you have and you figure it out. But before I go down that rabbit hole and kind of tell you how all this got started when I was a kid, let me assure you, I had the classics for the Nintendo as well. I bought the classic games like the Marios, the Zeldas, the Mega Mans, and I still have those to this day. So I don't want you to think that these were all the games I had for my Nintendo. I had a lot of really good games that were classics on the platform, but I could have had even more classics if I wasn't so fixated on the movie tie-in games. I could have had the Castlevanias and the Dragon Warriors and others that I missed out on because I was too busy asking for these kind of games. And in hindsight, on the one hand it sucks, but on the other hand, there are some benefits to having had that fixation. As an example, I also liked TV tie-in games like DuckTales, Chippendales Rescue Rangers, and Bucky O'Hare. And because I took good care of my games, I now find myself with a near mint complete copy of Bucky O'Hare for the NES. And that's quite a feather in your cap, especially when it's accidental luck. So where did all this get started for me? Well, I'd have to say, if you're forcing me to pick an origin point, it would be... Now, Ghostbusters is, by many accounts, a terrible game. I rented it as a kid. I really enjoyed it. And I think one of the reasons I enjoyed it so much when I was playing it was because I had the NES Max controller, which had a turbo button on it. Now, the Ghostbusters game is notoriously repetitive, and then you get to that final stage where you have to go up all those staircases in the hotel. The turbo button can help with that. I didn't get to beat the game. I'm not going to pretend that as a grade schooler I was able to beat Ghostbusters on a weekend rental, but I did enjoy it a lot. Now, I was in grade school. What can I say? I know that it's not a great game, but it had such an impact on my purchasing habits after that, even though I never owned it in childhood, that I did, probably about 10 years ago, pick up a complete boxed copy of the Nintendo cartridge to have in my collection, because it was the starting point for this madness, and you can see it right over there in the stack. So that's not a childhood original, but from my experience, it is the original movie tie-in game that got me hooked on all this. Right around this same time, I would have also picked up Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom for Nintendo. Now, this is because I loved the arcade game, but the arcade game had already been phased out of arcades by that point, and I was really hoping that this game was going to be a great port of that arcade game, and it notoriously is not. Done by Tengen, or Tengen, however you want to pronounce that word. They were a company that was an offshoot of Atari, and they kind of pulled some shenanigans to make unlicensed Nintendo games that got around the whole lockout chip. As a kid, I didn't care. All I knew was that the game was being sold legitimately in a toy store, there for a while anyway, and I wanted a copy. And I got it. And you got to be careful what you wish for. So I ended up playing this game a lot and being frustrated by it a lot. The colors were garish, it would give you a headache, you felt like you were never making progress. The farthest I ever got in the game was I got to the statue of Kali maybe a few times, and after that I could never survive the rest of the game. And from what I've seen in online videos, there was very little chance I was gonna actually clear the game because it is just crazy. The nice thing about that experience though was that not only do I have the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom Nintendo game still with its box and all of its materials, but I also have one of those infamous black Tengen cartridges, which admittedly I thought was a much cooler looking cartridge than the basic official Nintendo gray cartridge. Now this game would end up being re-released officially by Mindscape. Somehow Tengen worked out a deal with Mindscape to have this exact game re-released on their official Nintendo cartridge, and both versions of the game go for about the same price. It seems like the Mindscape one might be a little more valuable, but I think that depends on what side of the bed eBay wakes up on that morning. Around that same time, I also asked for Willow from Capcom. Now, this turned out to be a huge win, but I wouldn't know that for several years, because when I first got the game, as much as I liked the format, I was stuck. And I was stuck for several years, and I couldn't figure out why. Like so many Nintendo generation kids, I was so excited after The Legend of Zelda that they were coming out with a Zelda 2 that I asked for it for that Christmas, and I got it. And then when I started playing it, it was very disappointing. Zelda 2 is a real letdown for a lot of reasons, and it's a very divisive game in the Zelda franchise. I hated it personally. I never got anywhere close to completing it. I kept banging my head against the wall trying to get farther in it, and it just wasn't going to happen. I hated the format of the game, I hated the story, I hated everything about it. Then along comes the movie tie-in game for Willow, which you would think would not be any good, but it was a Capcom game. And it turns out to be what I wanted Zelda 2 to be. It utilizes the original Legend of Zelda game format, but it has better graphics, it has a more robust inventory system, it's got a sprawling, epic amount of levels and world areas to go through, and it's just a really, really good action RPG game. And I loved the crap out of it. The only reason that I was stuck for a while, about probably the better part of 2 years, was because I simply couldn't find a different trail out of a village. And I know that sounds ridiculous.
Well, that was really stupid, Peck.
But when you're a kid, you sometimes miss those things, and it's not as if the game was telling me to look for that trail. So I kept looking at the map I could see and traveling it and not being able to get anywhere. And then finally one day, I can't remember if I had a map finally from Nintendo Power, or if maybe I just got lucky one day and I finally went up the right path outside the village, but I was finally able to get to different areas, and suddenly the game opened up and it was twice as awesome as I had already initially thought it was, and now I could really do something with it, and I beat that game in childhood as well. Willow is a underrated lost gem of the original Nintendo. The next one after that, oddly enough, would have been Who Framed Roger Rabbit, one of the notorious LJN titles. I think we all, as kids, ended up with LJN titles in our Nintendo collection, probably because most of them were on clearance within months. But I asked for Who Framed Roger Rabbit for Christmas, because I loved the movie so much at the time, and there was a Nintendo game, and I thought, great, I can't wait to play this thing. I've cleared the game, and I cleared it in childhood. And I didn't have a problem with the way the game mechanics worked as far as driving the taxi or any of that stuff. It became very intuitive for me. I understood how that worked. It really helped me with tank control, thought, and mechanics, honestly, when I got to other games. I do admit that the game's format is really janky and very unconventional, and the game probably wouldn't be any fun as a revisit. And I was extremely frustrated, even as a child player, finally getting to the end and having to stop Judge Doom in that final very strange level. It's a very frustrating game. However, I did clear it. I don't have the hatred for it that a lot of people do, likely because I literally grew up with it in my collection and I kept working at it until I finished the game. Did I play it a lot after that? No. I'll freely admit that it wasn't some runaway hit in my mind. It was kind of a, oh, this isn't anywhere near as cool as I was hoping it would be. But I'm not going to give up on it because it's a game in my collection that I can play every day without having to rent it or ask for it. So I'll keep trying. And while I didn't complete it as soon as I completed Mario 2 or 3, I did end up beating it. And it was an oddly proud moment. After that, I'm not really sure what the order of games coming in was for movie tie-ins, but I'm pretty sure the next 3 were RoboCop, Dick Tracy, and The Rocketeer. RoboCop was probably first because I loved the arcade game. I absolutely loved it, and this Nintendo game looked like it was going to be a port of the arcade game, which it was. It wasn't a very good port, but it was a port, and I played the crap out of it and beat it a lot. I got to the point with that one where I could beat it all the time, and it was a nice alternative because I couldn't go to arcades all the time, especially after we were living in England, which is when I got this game to begin with. Dick Tracy was one that I got in the summer of 1991 when we were home from England for the summer. So we went back to the United States every summer for a few weeks, and then we'd fly back to the UK. And while I was over in the United States, I picked up Dick Tracy because I had heard they'd released it, and I was a big fan of the movie that had come out the year before, and I had to get American cartridges for my Nintendo because the PAL cartridges in England wouldn't work with my system. Dick Tracy is one of those infamous AVGN videos where he talks about how terrible the game is. I never really found that to be the case. Yes, the snipers in the city areas are very frustrating. But like I said, when you're a kid, you start to adapt and innovate. And I quickly realized the snipers don't come back once you come out of buildings and get back in your cop car. They're permanently gone. So I thought to myself, well, what I'll do, tedious as it is, it's kind of a soft hack of the game. I will take the first few minutes, or 20, 30 minutes, however long it takes, to go street by street, block by block, very carefully, and take out all the snipers in the city. And that way, I can then go to every mission without worrying about getting sniped to death in the car. And that is 50% of the battle with Dick Tracy. After that, all you've got to do is manage those weird side-scrolling levels, which that's just about getting used to the play controls and what weapons are at your disposal. And then the game's pretty straightforward at that point, following the clues and all that kind of stuff. I really enjoyed Dick Tracy. I'm not going to say that I played it and beat it all the time, but I cleared it a few times, and I was really happy about the fact that I had figured out how to get around the game's difficulties. I had unlocked a strategy to make the game very playable. And that's a proud gaming moment for me. When I watched these videos where everybody was hating on this game, I was like, why don't you just clear the snipers out of the city first before you do anything? That's what I did when I was 11 or 12 or however old I was. I guess I was 12 or 13. Again, I'm not going to say the game is, Legend of Zelda or Super Mario 3 or anything like that, but it certainly, in my estimation, as somebody who literally owned it, I don't think it's the dog pile that people make it out to be. The next summer, when we returned to the United States, the summer of '92, I made sure to pick up The Rocketeer on NES. Both of these were done by Bondi. I thought was kind of a weird coincidence. Dick Tracy and The Rocketeer were both Bondi games, and I got them 2 summers in a row when I came back to the US for vacation. Now, The Rocketeer on NES is quite a good game. I know some people say they don't like it, but I found The Rocketeer to be immediately playable, a great inventory system with a wide variety of weapons and options like the rocket pack and your jumps and punches and all the scenery in the background. I thought The Rocketeer was an extremely well done game. It's definitely better than Dick Tracy by a mile, and it's very, very fun to play. It has a difficulty curve at times, but it's worth getting past the difficulty curve because it feels rewarding, kind of like Super Mario. And I had a lot of fun clearing this game. I did it many times in childhood. It just spoke to me. The whole 1930s kind of atmosphere, all of the great background graphics of all the vintage airplanes and all that stuff. I loved the Rocketeer game for the NES. It was so good, and I have nothing but praise for it. This would have also been around the same time that I acquired Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for Nintendo. Now, just like Temple of Doom, there ended up being two versions of Last Crusade on Nintendo. There was the original by Ubisoft, which was the port that went to every game system known to man that was the very, very crappy side-scrolling platformer that everybody who's played it absolutely hates. And then there was the later one that was done by Taito that was exclusive to the Nintendo, and that's the one I have and played in childhood. It's a very weird game where Indy's throwing karate kicks and stuff in the combat sections. There's a wide variety of play formats between slide puzzles and overhead vehicle chases, and then more typical side-scrolling beat-em-up levels. It can be very short because you can opt to skip certain things if you want, but you can also play it to completion rather than just play it and win by doing 20%. I ended up clearing the game a lot in childhood because of this, because I could test different combos to get me to the end stage. And I really liked it overall. Was it short? Yeah. Was it the greatest game in the world? No. But did I think it was bad? No, not really. I liked it. And I'm really glad to have it in my collection. About the same time that we got The Rocketeer, we also got Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And of course, living in England at the time that movie came out, we made sure to get that game. This game very much was like Willow, where it was punching above its weight. It was one of those movie tie-ins that decided to be a lot more than just the movie. And to do that, like Willow, it was an action RPG set in medieval England, and it was extremely fun to play. I know some people have claimed online that it's not that great, but I've found Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves to be extremely immersive, really worth putting your time into, a lot of fun and very rewarding, and I loved the way the whole game was laid out. I loved the medieval scenery, I loved the music, everything about it. I thought they really did a good job. And Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves to me is one of those that I'm very proud to have in my game collection. And not just because it's Robin Hood, but because they actually pulled off a good game. They put more thought into it than just do the movie, and that's it. I would say Robin Hood, as an example, is definitely a cut above Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which follows the movie very closely in all of its scenarios, but it's not as rewarding or fulfilling. It's a very cop-out kind of game. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, though, you'll get the hours out of it. And again, it's a really satisfying RPG action experience. Now, at this time, a big bombshell happened, because I was a Star Wars fan in childhood who was now an adolescent Nintendo owner. And LucasArts and JVC, Lucasfilm Games was what they called themselves at the time, they announced they were coming out with a Star Wars game for Nintendo, which was wild to me because typically older properties did not actually get games on the Nintendo if they were from before the Nintendo's existence. Temple of Doom, I thought, was an exception because it was trying to be a port of a 1985 arcade game, which would have been right around or just before the time the Nintendo launched. Whereas Star Wars, all the way back to 1977, the arcade game came out in '83, and it was a vector graphics game that wasn't even ported to Vectrex. I thought, what could this possibly be? And sure enough, it was a very involved game that sort of expanded on the world of the first movie and gave you the platforming adventure version, the Nintendo platformer version of the first Star Wars movie, with a lot of artistic license. And I could not wait to get my hands on this game. So my dad coordinated with a friend of his who was temporarily going back to the US on a business trip to pick it up while he was there and bring it back. So I was able to get it for that Christmas or whatever it was. I played the hell out of that game. I got to the point where I could beat it on 100% all day, every day. It was a lot of fun, and it's one of the best Nintendo games I've ever had, and I'm really glad it is because it was Star Wars, so if it had been a letdown, I would have been crushed. And to my shock and surprise, they announced The Empire Strikes Back was coming out the next year as a sequel to that Star Wars game. I couldn't have been happier, being that Empire Strikes Back was my favorite movie in the trilogy. So of course, we did the same strategy again to get that game, I assume. I wanted it. My parents helped me figure out how to coordinate with somebody my dad knew who was going back on a business trip to buy it while he was there and bring it back. And I got to play that one and have it as a kid. Totally different format of a game. Not as repeatably fun as the Star Wars game. It was a totally different platformer that had jankier controls. You were Luke the whole time. You couldn't switch out between the characters. It was true-ish to the movie with some narrative compromises, but the general story flow was correct. A very frustrating game as far as the enemies versus the power of your weapons, and the force powers, while very usable, were not always very effective. Sometimes you would end up hurting yourself more than you would hurt the enemies using them. So that was kind of frustrating. If I didn't have that NES Max with that turbo option on that fire button, I don't know how I would have ever beaten that game. But I did manage to clear that game, and I cleared it a few times. Not as many times as I was able to clear Star Wars once I got good at it, but I did power through and I cleared Empire Strikes Back several times. Some really impressive production value on that game.
The Force is with you, young Skywalker.
Just not anywhere near as good as the Star Wars game. The last major movie tie-in game that I got for the original Nintendo Entertainment System was Star Trek 25th Anniversary. I had heard some rumblings about this game on PC as a point-and-click adventure, and I didn't have a PC at the time as an adolescent that could really run that game. I thought, well, maybe the Nintendo game will be the next best thing. The Nintendo game is very dry. Like it's definitely a game for original series Star Trek fans, of which I was one. So you power through playing that game. It's not a bad game, but it is, like Star Trek itself, more cerebral. The game format for the Nintendo isn't so much a point-and-click adventure because that's not something the Nintendo could really do. And so they make it a little bit more of a Zelda-type format where you travel to different worlds and try and solve different cosmic problems and challenges that your crew faces going to these different planets. It's not a bad game. I beat it, I think, twice. I did really enjoy it while I was playing it because I was one of those kids that liked those kinds of challenges in the Zelda format. You know, I was a big fan of games like Faxanadu, and I would become a big fan of Secret of Mana. And while this game was nowhere near the caliber of those, the Star Trek veneer over it and the thought that went into the different scenarios and challenges you had to go through and the items you had to find made up for it. So I really enjoyed Star Trek 25th Anniversary for the Nintendo. I did not enjoy it anywhere near as much as the actual PC CD-ROM experience that I finally picked up a few years later. That game is a masterpiece. But if you couldn't get your hands on that one, this was something of a stopgap. I'm not going to say it was totally satisfying, but you got your Star Trek fix on Nintendo with it. And that was pretty amazing given that Star Trek was a 1960s property. Now, in the background of all of this, if you're wondering where some of the other famous movie tie-in games are in my collection, remember, I was a kid, I only had so many asks, so I tried to strategize. So for example, if my friend had a game such as Batman, that's a real example, and I could play it a lot without having to go rent it because my friend had it, well, then I wasn't going to waste an ask on that one. Similarly, things like Terminator 2, I would rent or borrow from a friend to see if I wanted it badly enough, and then I'd make a determination, or I would forget about it. It's often possible that I forgot about it in the shuffle to get something else, and I ended up not ever owning it. And now we come to the Super Nintendo transition. So Super Nintendo arrives in the early 90s, and the first thing I get is Super Star Wars. That should come as no surprise, and Super Star Wars was an amazing game. I still maintain it's the best entry out of all three in the Super Star Wars trilogy. Beautiful graphics, great music, really good character animation, really good challenge. It's monotonous by today's standards, but by 1991-92 standards, this was a real 16-bit platformer action game. This is what we expected. This is what we wanted. This is what we were looking for. It really delivered. I got to the point where I could clear that game pretty regularly, and that shows you what youthful reflexes can accomplish. Right on the heels of that, though, I made the mistake of asking for the Super Nintendo version of The Rocketeer, because I had so much fun with the Nintendo version, and I thought, well, the Super Nintendo version is going to be different with better graphics. What can go wrong? Apparently everything. The Super Nintendo version of The Rocketeer is truly one of the worst video games I've ever played. I hate it. The only reason I still own it is because I'm a Rocketeer fan. Otherwise, I would have sold it off for pennies to Electronics Boutique or GameStop years ago. I just hold on to it because it's a piece of Rocketeer merchandise. But otherwise, I've never been able to clear it. I have no idea what the secret is to getting around those poles with the racing airplane. I can never do it. I haven't been able to do it in 30 years. I've given up on this game. I hate it. I want to throw it in a volcano. End of story. One of the best movie tie-ins for the Super Nintendo that I rented was Batman Returns. I loved that game. Now, the reason I don't own it is because I ended up beating it while I rented it. Because I loved it so much, I just wouldn't stop playing it because It was Batman showing up and beating up clowns, and I loved that. And it was a Final Fight style beat-em-up game, and I loved that format of game, so I just played it through the weekend and cleared it. So I didn't have an immediate priority to ask for it, although I would have gladly owned it, and I kind of regret not owning it. So maybe one day I will pick it up, although I don't even have a working Super Nintendo console to enjoy the game anymore. So that's probably why I'm dragging my feet and will probably just emulate it for the rest of my life. But I loved Batman Returns. That was the next major movie tie-in game that I played on the Super Nintendo. The next one I owned, which should come as no surprise, is Super Empire Strikes Back. Now, while this game was more polished and it had a lot more variety and graphic sophistication than Super Star Wars, in hindsight, with a lot of analysis, it's a very, very good game. There's nothing to be taken away from it. I cleared it many times. I enjoyed it immensely. But I don't think it's actually as good as Super Star Wars. I think there's something that holds it back, and I think the main thing that holds it back is that Super Star Wars kind of forced you to find the advantages of all the selectable characters as well as the blaster weapons. But when they get to Super Empire Strikes Back, suddenly, when you're Luke Skywalker the majority of the time, and they've perfected that lightsaber jumping twirl move, that's all you really need to do. And so you end up doing that for hours on end to beat the game, because you're almost totally invincible when you're doing that lightsaber somersault. So that becomes the game. Now, it does mean that you can clear the game, and it does mean that in the levels where you're Luke Skywalker, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and just go for it. But it really doesn't make for a satisfying, balanced gaming experience when you really look back on it. So I would say Super Empire Strikes Back is an extremely good game. I enjoyed it. I own it to this day. It's a great memory in my Super Nintendo play history, but I don't think it has the edge on Super Star Wars. Not for me anyway. And then, of course, the very next Christmas, I asked for Super Return of the Jedi. Again, a good game. A very good action platformer, done in the vein of Super Star Wars and Super Empire Strikes Back. So unlike the Nintendo games that were totally different, and by the way, there was never a Nintendo version of Return of the Jedi, which is very disappointing. Super Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi are all the same format of game. They just have slightly different quirks to them. Like, for example, in Return of the Jedi, for some reason, they changed Luke Skywalker's running animation. So now he doesn't run the way he did in Star Wars and Empire. He is almost modeled after that quick little sprint that he does on the skiff over the Sarlacc. And what makes that even more odd is that the running animation for Luke Skywalker in Star Wars and Empire seems to be modeled after the way he ran on the deck of the sail barge. So both running models come from Return of the Jedi, but they changed his animation for Return of the Jedi to a way that he only runs for like 0.2 seconds. Ultimately, I think by that point, Return of the Jedi felt like an obligation rather than something I was really gunning for. I was devoted to the Star Wars merchandise in the dark times, especially the video games. So as much as I wanted to have Return of the Jedi in my collection, I think that game was naturally at a disadvantage with me by that point. I didn't hate it. I cleared it a few times, but then I boxed it away, put it on display, and never really played it again because Star Wars and Empire were largely better games. And Return of the Jedi not only felt like an obligation on my part, it almost felt like a sort of layup obligation on the part of the people that made it because they'd already made the first two. So it's not a bad game. If it's the only Super Star Wars game you ever played, I'm sure you had a lot of fun with it. But it is, in the same vein as Super Empire, really just an opportunity for you to run through a bunch of levels doing that lightsaber somersault over and over and over and over and over again, with only a few levels where you get to play Han or Leia or Wicket the Ewok. And even the Mode 7 levels going into the Death Star that should have been really exciting just weren't. They really felt cheaper looking than the Hoth battle in Empire Strikes Back or the Death Star battle at the end of Star Wars. And when it comes to my childhood, teenage years of movie tie-in games, it all ends with a rental that I really enjoyed, and then for some reason, never asked to get it. And that was Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures, which was really the fourth installment in the LucasArts Super Nintendo series. LucasArts and JVC came together and said, let's do a Super Star Wars for Indiana Jones, except this time were going to combine all 3 of his movies into one game, which admittedly sucks. I would have loved a Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and Last Crusade as separate cartridges. That would have compelled me to really want to get them. At the same time, though, I can see why they did that, and at the time I was playing these games, it was probably the best move, because I was already burned out by Super Return of the Jedi, and when I saw at the time that the Indiana Jones game was just a grab bag of Indiana Jones' greatest scenes in Super Star Wars format, I was more than a little disappointed. At the time. However, in hindsight, I will say that Indiana Jones is actually the best game after Super Star Wars. I think those 2 are the number 1 and 2 entries in this LucasArts series. Super Empire Strikes Back is really, really good. Super Return of the Jedi is very competent. There's nothing wrong with the game, but there's something about the way they kind of got their energy back doing Indiana Jones that shows. And so Indiana Jones shines in a way that the Super Star Wars original entry does. Now, why I didn't get this game at the time is because I was burned out on the format, and I was a little bitter that they crammed all 3 movies into one game. I was like, oh, I'll get around to it then. I didn't get it. I regretted it. But then this Christmas, my nephew, of all people, he gifted me a very nice collectible copy, complete with every piece of paperwork inside. It even came with its own protective case around the box. It's not sealed, it's a used copy, but it has every single bit in there. It was clearly as well cared for as I cared for my games back when I was a kid. This is how that game would have looked, just like my Super Star Wars cartridges right here, if I had bought it and held on to it. So this kind of caps off my childhood console gaming movie tie-in journey. The last major one I played in that age bracket, in that time of my life, is now here in my collection, which is kind of wild, 2024, and there it is. I did end up playing other games that were movie tie-ins later, but they weren't very good, like Phantom Menace for the PC. I mean, is that even worth talking about? That was the last major one. Most of the things that I've played that are tie-ins to movies are original stories, like this new Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. So it's tied to the franchise while not mimicking the film. But yeah, this is the long, weird journey of Michael's fixation with movie tie-in games for the Nintendo and Super Nintendo Entertainment Systems. I was that kid. And it had its benefits and it had its downsides. More benefits than downsides, I would say. I think I was a more innovative game player as a result. Saw a wider variety of game formats. I regret nothing. And it's really nice to be able to see all these together because I don't break them out all that often because I don't play old consoles anymore. I have my old Nintendo, but I don't, and it works, but I just don't sit down in front of the CRT and play them. I'd rather be making videos about them. So yeah, this is the weird Michael collection of movie tie-in games from all the way back when I was little to somewhat little. So thanks for watching this, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you on the next video.